is the sources that were used by Muhammad in the creation of the Quran. Obviously, for a Muslim, there is no such thing as the sources for the Quran. There is only one source, and that source is Allah. But for a secular historian, Muhammad must have gotten his material from somewhere. So, from where did he get it? The important thing to remember here is that Muhammad lived in a world in which Judaism and Christianity looked quite a bit different than they do today. A lot of people assume that when Muhammad showed up, there were people called Jews, there were people called Christians, and then because of him, there were now people called Muslims. Three nice, neatly divided groups. But this was not the case. For example, the Talmud, which would go on to become the authoritative text for rabbinical Judaism, was only recently completed. It was finished around the year 500 CE, just 70 years before the birth of Muhammad. So there was likely still quite a bit of diversity among Jews, especially in faraway places such as southern Arabia and Ethiopia. And the same was true of Christianity. As I mentioned in my video on the Gospels, there were initially many different Christianities, and it took many centuries before the dominant version stamped out all the other versions, which it considered to be heresies. Remember, although it started in the 1st century CE, Christianity didn't really take off until the 4th century CE, when it became the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. It would thus have been around the 4th and 5th centuries, not too long before Muhammad, that the so-called heretical versions of Christianity might have shifted to places outside of Roman influence. Places like, Arabia. In other words, it's not hard to imagine that Muhammad would have come into contact with various different types of Christians and Jews, and that the types of Christians and Jews that he came into contact with were the ones that were outside of the mainstream. For example, there once existed a group called the Ebionites that fit somewhere in between Judaism and Christianity. On the one hand, they accepted Jesus as an important prophet and saw him as being the Messiah. But on the other hand, they rejected his divinity and continued to follow Jewish laws, such as not eating pork. Sounds a lot like Islam to me. As far as we know, the Ebionites had mostly disappeared by the time that Muhammad came onto the scene. However, there were likely still groups around that had been influenced by them, groups that then perhaps went on to influence Muhammad. So now that you understand the general situation, let's get down to some specifics. If you're familiar with the Bible and then start to read the Quran, you'll definitely notice some similarities. Many of the same characters show up, and even some of the same stories are told. However, some of the stories are quite different. For example, sometimes there is information missing, and other times there is information added. If you watch our video about the Islamic Prophet's family tree, which I'll link to in the description, you can find out more about what these similarities and differences are. One thing that is clear is that Muhammad did not copy directly from the Bible. In other words, there are no sections of the Quran where the text matches perfectly with text from the Bible. It's more like he heard someone summarize a biblical story, and then he in turn summarized it using his own words. But what about all the extra information, the various details that are not found anywhere in the Bible? Well, let's look at several examples. The first is a story about Abraham. In the Quran, in Surah 21, Abraham smashes his father's idols during his youth in Babylon, and then is thrown into a fire by the king as a punishment. But God saves him, and he survives unharmed. Now, although this story is not found in the Bible, it is in fact found in a text that predates the Quran. It comes from a commentary on the book of Genesis written by a rabbi sometime between 300 and 500 CE. So it's certainly possible that Muhammad was familiar with the story. Another example is a story about Mary, the mother of Jesus. In the Quran, in Surah 19, Mary comes across a palm tree while she is pregnant. In order to feed his mother, Jesus performs a miracle from within the womb, causing figs to fall from the tree when shaken. Again, this story is not found in any of the 4 canonical Gospels. However, as I mentioned in my episode about the Gospels, there were actually many other Gospels, ones that did not make it into the New Testament. One of these is known as Pseudo-Matthew. In Pseudo-Matthew, a very similar story is told about Mary and the palm tree. The only difference is that in Pseudo-Matthew, the palm tree actually bends its branches so that Mary can reach the figs. Now, Pseudo-Matthew was written around the same time as Muhammad lived, but in a very different location. So I think it's unlikely that Muhammad got the story directly from Pseudo-Matthew, or that Pseudo-Matthew got it directly from Muhammad. What's more likely is that this was simply a well-known story that was floating around at the time and that both authors were familiar with it. My third example is the story of the sleepers in the cave. In the Quran, in Surah 18, it tells a story about some men who were being persecuted for their beliefs. They take refuge in a cave where God causes them to go into a deep sleep, one that miraculously lasts over 300 years. They therefore end up escaping the persecution. This story is actually a well-known Christian legend that appears in multiple sources predating the Quran, the earliest one being that of the Syrian poet Jacob of Sirah. One more example. Later in the same surah, Surah 18, the Quran mentions a man called Dhul Qarnayn, a phrase that literally means the two-horned one. According to the Quran, Dhul Qarnayn travels to the east, to a mountainous region where a group of people are being persecuted by 2 evil nations, known as Gog and Magog. He helps them by building a giant wall to keep Gog and Magog at bay. This story is very similar to a well-known legend about Alexander the Great that was very common in ancient times. In fact, Alexander the Great was often depicted as having horns, hence the name Dhul Qarnayn, the two-horned one. What all of these examples show is that the Quran includes many stories that can be found in other texts that existed at the time when it was created. So not only did the Quran use the Bible as a source, it also used Jewish commentaries, Christian apocryphal literature, and even sources that contain stories about pagan heroes. In other words, the Quran was very much a product of its time. Let me put it this way. If a person were to go back in a time machine to the Middle East in the year 600 CE and randomly collect a bunch of stories that were popular at the time, that collection would likely look very similar to the contents of the Quran. Of course, the Quran also includes commentary on those stories and theological lessons, so even if one doesn't see the Quran as being a word-for-word miracle sent from God, one can still see it as containing valuable insight. Now, of course, one could argue that the reason why the Quran contains many stories that can be found in other literature of the time is that the Quran is in fact an accurate account of events, authored by the creator of the universe. Taken on faith, this is indeed a valid position. However, taken strictly on the principles of the historical method, it is not. There is a clear textual history that demonstrates how the various biblical stories developed over time. However, according to Muslims, the Bible is simply a corrupt version of several now lost texts, such as the Torah, the Zabur, and the Injil. If this were true, one would expect to find some sort of textual evidence for these older works. But as of yet, no such evidence has ever been found. Finally, I want to mention a hypothesis about the Quran that is very much just a hypothesis, meaning that it is definitely not the mainstream position, even among secular scholars. It is the one found in the 2000 book, The Syro-Aramaic Reading of the Quran, by Christoph Luxemburg. In this book, Luxemburg uses linguistic arguments to claim that the Quran was heavily influenced by the Syriac language, a language that was spoken in Syria and much of the Middle East during the time of Muhammad. In particular, Syriac was used by early Christians, and therefore Luxembourg argues that certain sections of the Quran might be directly based on Syriac liturgies. Now, it might seem odd to claim that the most famous book written in Arabic is actually heavily based on a totally different language, in this case, Syriac. However, keep in mind that the Arabic of the Quran is in fact quite mysterious in parts. Because Arabic doesn't have vowels, there is always some room for debate on how to translate certain words. But again, let me remind you that this last hypothesis has yet to gain very much traction.